The Yuri Kochiyama Cultural Center was originally called the Unite Asia Cultural Center, or the UACC. The UACC was founded in 1989 after 5 years of lobbying and discussions by students, faculties, and staff. Spearheading these discussions and initiatives was Professor Lucy Nguyen. Professor Nguyen had taught in the Asian languages and literature and served as the academic advisor to the bilingual collegiate program, as well as being the vice chair of the Governor's Advisory Council on Refugees and Immigrants. The reason behind the need for this cultural center was due to the rapidly increasing number of Asian and Asian American students enrolling at the university. As such, the vision that some faculty and staff had was to create a separate program for Asian students modeled on the bilingual collegiate program. Originally, there was an Asian component to the BCP, but Professor Nguyen felt that it was not enough and as such pushed to convince Anne Quinley, who was the Dean of Academic Support Services, to help advocate for a separate center. The UACC found its home in 2 basement rooms of Knowlton dorms in Northeast residential area. The open house for center was on October 24, 1989, and was attended by many students, faculty, staff, including the Chancellor Richard O'Brien. During the first year, the UACC was governed by a board of 15 students representing their native Asian countries. In a collegiate article published on October 24, 1990, which marks the first anniversary of the UACC, Amy Chi, an undergraduate student, was cited. "The center is something that is permanent, I hope. We can always come back to it. It's like a home, where the welcome mat is."
I'll tell you one thing, all the support programs, right, they work very well with each other. Whenever we talk to each other, right, we were absolutely on the same page because everybody faced the same problems.
On December 14, 1989, Dennis Madison, the Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, sent a memo to his staff stating that, quote, "It was also planned that principal administrative responsibility for the cultural centers will move from housing services to academic support services," end quote. In the Collegian, the Asian and Latino students released a statement with a list of demands and changes they want Chancellor Richard O'Brien and the university to implement. These requests include funding for more supplies as well as more staff. The students also stated that they were willing to sacrifice the budgets that the cultural centers had in order to transfer the funds to the resource centers. They understood, even if school didn't, how vital culturally sensitive academic support services were for students of color. As highlighted in a self-conducted interview about his years at UMass, it did not seem like Chancellor O'Brien took the students of color seriously.
I was principally involved in endless, as it seemed, conversations with the 4 principal ethnic groups on campus and listened to their concerns, and all of them took the form of a sense of injustice, a sense that they had been neglected for years, that there had been total inaction and lack of support. Later on, a year later, I had some historical work done to list the things that were done in support of multiculturalism and specifically in the support of different ethnic groups, and a tremendous amount had been done. But of course students do have short memories, and there wasn't much of an inclination to try and remember all these things, so that discontent was certainly the order of the day.
In an interview, Anne Quinley reflects upon the university's meaning of diversity.
There was a time when people thought the end game was to get more, African American, Latino, Asian American students enrolled. And I think it was only after that had been begun that people appreciated that different populations would want different things.
In 1993, the UACC decided to close the center in order to transfer the budget of the UACC to the UALRC. Upon hearing this, Professor Lucy Nguyen contacted Anne Quinley and told her about the students' decision. This resulted in a succession of meetings between Anne Quinley and the students who, quote, continued to exert pressure for more resources, end quote. A new student organization, the Asian Alliance, was formed. The Asian Alliance scheduled meetings with the Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs. The meetings were successful and resulted in expanding the physical space for the UALRC. The UALRC Advisory Board gathered to discuss issues with the Space Management Office and Interim Dean Kenneth Burnham, who had replaced Anne Quinley before she left for a different job. The UALRC was able to expand beyond the 2 rooms into the whole basement of Knowlton. The large UALRC was opened on September of 1993. The center now has a reception room, a conference room, offices, a new kitchen, and 2 smaller rooms for staff, as well as an office for the UACC. The UACC was also able to get an activities room in the basement of Worcester Dining Hall. The UACC changed its name to the Yuri Kochiyama Cultural Center, the YKCC, because the Asian American Student Association, ASA, had invited the Asian American activist Yuri Kochiyama to a school for Asian Night. Yuri Kochiyama's belief in liberation and racial justice reflected the core values of the center. Chona, who served as the assistant director of the center, spoke of the painting of Yuri, which decorates the wall of the YKCC. She remembers that the mural was done by a fine arts student. The following information about the fate of the YKCC and the UALRC was provided by Professor Cian Lei.
So I started at UMass in 2003, and at that time, the support centers and the academic support centers and the cultural support centers were separate. So you had the YKCC being the social support center for Asian American students at UMass. The academic support was handled by what was then called the United Asia Learning Resource Center, the UALRC. And I was much more involved with them, so which made sense because I'm from the academic side. And so they brought me on to be part of their executive board, and so we had a really good relationship. I developed a good working relationship with the director at that time, Linda Alf, and the assistant director, Chona. And then a few years, maybe 4 or 5 years after I got here, one of the former vice chancellors for student affairs, Michael Gargano, started putting up a proposal and started circulating the idea that we should consolidate all of these academic support centers. In addition to the UALRC for Asian American students, you had academic support centers for African American students, Latinx students, Native American Indian students, etc. So, he sort of was operating on this kind of colorblind ideology. First of all, that he didn't really see the need to have all these academic support centers, that, he was questioning why students of color would, in his view, want to segregate themselves and not integrate themselves with the rest of the campus. Sort of the same kind of conservative, colorblind ideologies that operate in the rest of U.S. society. So he started the idea, and then one of the next vice chancellors for student affairs was Brian Bullock. And, we actually had high hopes because he was African American himself. So we thought he would understand the need to keep the support centers separate. But he was really the one who really pushed this idea to consolidate them. And he sort of used a different argument. He tried to argue that he had some research to show that students of color at UMass wanted what he called a more mainstream experience. And he really wasn't able to articulate exactly what that was, but I think it sort of alluded to, students of color coming from predominantly white backgrounds who were used to that kind of environment, and or sort of mixed race, multiracial students who were becoming, I guess, more prominent in society and on campus in general. So many of us really tried to fight back against that, and we organized meetings and tried to block it as much as we could. But in the end, we were not successful, and all of the academic support centers were consolidated, and this was how CMAS was formed. Ironically, after CMAS was formed, Brian Bullock left. And so now we had CMAS in existence. All the individual support centers didn't exist anymore. They kept the social support centers like the YKCC separate. But after CMAS was formed, I think the staff who were reassigned there did whatever they could to make it a success, to really try to transfer what they had been doing in their support centers into CMAS. And I was part of that effort as well, trying to make sure CMAS really supported students of color as best as possible.
So what happens from here? In my conversation with Professor Lay, he speaks of his vision for the direction of where he hopes the students of color will go.
Well, I think hopefully they will complement each other, that CMAS will continue to promote issues of social justice, social equality, and ideally I'd like to see that focus transfer onto the groups that the YKCC works with more, the RSOs, the Asian American fraternities and sororities. It would be nice if they emphasize those kinds of activities more, and certainly in my own self-interest, I hope that translates into more students completing the Asian and Asian American Studies certificate. So hopefully all of those goals can mesh well together and all come together.